Disclaimer. The content on this YouTube channel includes true stories, some of which are based on real life facts, and some are fiction. We do not claim ownership of any of the stories presented on this channel. We have sourced stories from various online and offline sources, and we have made reasonable efforts to ensure that the stories are accurate and reliable. However, we cannot guarantee the accuracy or completeness of the information presented. The stories presented on this channel are for entertainment purposes only, and any reliance on the stories is strictly at your own risk. We do not accept any responsibility for any loss, injury, or damage that may arise from your use of the stories or any information presented on this channel. Please note that the stories presented on this channel may not be suitable for all audiences. Viewer discretion is advised. Welcome to Demonic Diaries, the YouTube channel where we explore the darkest corners of the human mind. Join me, your host, as I delve into the pages of terrifying tales and haunting stories. From the depths of hell to the darkest depths of the human psyche, we'll be your guide through the most bone-chilling and spine-tingling stories that will keep you up at night. So buckle up and prepare to be scared, because on Demonic Diaries, every story has a dark side. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button and ring the bell to be notified of new videos. Let's get started. Number 1. She was dressed in white, wearing an old-fashioned dress far too fancy for an evening alone in a small restaurant like ours. Her wide-brimmed hat was adorned with lilies, and she refused to take it off, leaving half of her face hidden in its shadow. Nobody had noticed her come in. It was as if she had just materialized into her chair. She had chosen to sit all the way in the back at one of our least favorite tables. The lighting didn't properly reach this part of the room, leaving it in a state of perpetual darkness. People generally avoided sitting here. She didn't seem to mind. There were lots of other free tables, but she didn't make a move for any of them. She barely moved at all, in fact. She didn't wave or call out for somebody to serve her. She just sat there silent and motionless. My coworker was already busy waiting on a few tables, which meant that the woman in white was my responsibility. I approached her, carrying a menu and a tray of napkins in one hand, and a glass jar containing a tea light in the other. Her head tracked my movement as I weaved past a bunch of empty tables. I forced a smile onto my face. "Hello. Glad to have you as our guest. Can I get you something to drink while you look through our menu?" I felt a growing sense of unease as I rattled down my standard greeting. Something was very off about this woman. Her dress was not the pristine white it had seemed from a distance. Large yellowish stains littered the fabric, as if it had been left lying in a damp place for a long time. The long strands of her straight black hair were of uneven length, and stuck together in a strange way. The sight evoked an unpleasant memory. Once upon a time, when I was a kid, I had gotten a bad case of head lice. My hair had looked exactly like that back then. Even more unsettling than all of that was her smell, a dense, cloying scent, intense and artificial, the smell of flowers layered on so thickly that it bit my nostrils. It smelled as if she had dumped an entire bottle of perfume over her body, and even that couldn't completely hide the underlying moldy odor. Breathing it all in nearly made me gag. Somehow I managed to keep my composure. "I can highly recommend our fresh cart today," I said, while positioning the menu and the napkins in front of her. "Or the mushroom potato casserole if you're looking for a vegan option." I hastily grabbed the glass jar to light up the candle inside. The faster I was done here, the quicker I could get away. "I already know what I want." Her voice was raw and deep. By now the candle was burning. I reached for my little notebook and turned back towards her. My body froze. The light of the candle hadn't dispelled the creepy atmosphere surrounding the woman. It had made it worse. Now I could see the unnatural stillness of her face. There was not a single twitch of a muscle, no wrinkling of the skin, no rising of her cheekbones, nothing. Her features would have been stunningly beautiful otherwise, but this lack of motion made her look uncanny and disturbing. She didn't seem like a person. She seemed like something else entirely. The candlelight had also done nothing to drive away the shadow hiding her upper face. It just made the darkness stand out even more. The fire was reflected back from her eyes, and they suddenly sparked up within the darkness, two glowing orbs fixated right on me, unblinking and merciless. "I already know what I want," she said again, and I noticed that I had just been staring at her for the last few seconds. I swallowed, and forced myself to look down onto my notebook. "That's great," I said, my voice suddenly hoarse. "What can I get you?" "Sit with me," she said. "What?" I looked up, the tip of my pen still resting on my notebook. Her head turned towards the chair on the opposite side of the table, then back towards me. "Such a warm and pretty thing," she said. "Come sit with me." I struggled to keep the neutral smile on my face. The clenching pressure began building up within my bowels, as if some invisible hand had pushed into my abdomen, and was now squeezing down on my innards. Sorry, but I'm in the middle of work. I'm afraid I can't just sit with you. I'd be happy to get you your order though, or anything else you might need." "Come sit with me," she repeated, and just as she spoke something suddenly moved on her face. It was minuscule, but it stood out among the unnatural stillness of her features. The left side of her nose bulged a little. Something thin and black poked out with a little twitch. I thought it was a hair at first, but then it twitched again, and it grew longer and wider, and then a big blowfly emerged from her nostril. It came to rest above her upper lip, rubbing its hind legs over its wings. She didn't react at all. After a few seconds the fly lifted off, circled around the flickering candle twice, then headed towards the kitchen entrance. I stood there frozen, my mind reeling from what I had just witnessed. "Come sit with me," the woman repeated a third time, and I stumbled away from her. Sorry, I just need to work." I gestured towards the room with a slightly panicked movement. "Lots of other table to wait on. I need to just call me if you've decided on your order." I never found a way to properly finish my stuttering speech. I just turned away mid-sentence, and hurried back towards the well-lit sections of the room. Her stare burned into the back of my neck, but she didn't stop me. She also didn't call me back all evening. At some point I noticed that she had vanished from the table. Nobody had seen her come in, and nobody had seen her leave either. The tension within me began to seep away. My body allowed itself to relax. It had been a creepy encounter, but nothing actually bad had happened. Now it was over. It'd probably make for a good story to tell at a party. My workday came to a close. The last guests left. We cleaned up and said our goodbyes for the night. It was just past 1 a.m. when I finally got home. I kicked off my shoes, rubbed my aching feet, and headed to the kitchen to make myself a little bedtime snack. I was in the middle of rummaging through one of the pantry lockers when the light bulb above me suddenly blew. For a short moment I stood in the darkness. Then a candle flame whisked to life behind me. I froze in horror. She was still dressed in white, now sitting at my kitchen table, hands folded in her lap. The menu of our restaurant was lying next to her, the tray of napkins right beside it. The small glass jar holding the tea light was positioned at the center of the table. "No more work," she said. "No other tables to wait on. Now you can sit with me. Such a warm and pretty thing. Come and sit with me." I tried to say something, but the sudden crushing tension of my fear squeezed my throat tight. The only sound coming out of my mouth was a feeble choking whimper. "Sit with me." A forceful note crept into her voice, and she leaned forward. I shoved myself away. Her head abruptly jerked to the side with a series of twitches. Something squirmed within the shadow beneath her hat. The silhouette of a small wriggling body began emerging from her ear, until a final violent twitch of knocked it free. The thing tumbled down, hit her shoulder, and landed right in front of her. It was a huge black cockroach. The insect lay on its back, frantically kicking its legs to get upright. It looked just as panicked and disoriented as I felt myself. The woman looked at it for a moment, then swooped down. She extended her tongue, a blackish and bloated thing, and licked across the tabletop, scooping up the roach. A single leg still stuck out from between her lips when she pulled back. There was a faint crunching sound. She swallowed. "Sit with me. I will eat, and when I am finished we can go to my place," she said. "Wouldn't that be wonderful? Come sit with me. Sit with me. Sit with me." She raised one hand, beckoning me to step closer. Her nails were broken and chipped, with something dark clinging beneath them. Her arm stretched towards me. I should have been far out of her reach, but just as the extended limb seemed to have reached its limits, it began to grow longer, inching closer and closer, her fingers clawing through the air. I scrambled backwards, or I tried at least, because I was already forced flat against the wall. There was nowhere to retreat. The woman was sitting between me and the only door. The only other exit was the window to my back, a 5-story drop onto asphalt pavement. "Sit with me," the woman said. "Sit with me. Sit with me. Sit with me." Sit, and her hand stretched closer and closer, the faint touch of her long broken nails, already brushing against the front of my shirt. I tried to move, or to think, or to do anything, but I was completely frozen, and her hand came even closer, and my mouth snapped open and shut, struggling to scream for help, or to beg for mercy, to make any sound at all. And then I managed to squeeze out one lone sentence. It was a sentence ingrained into me after years of working in the food service industry, an empty automatic response that I didn't even have to think about. That was probably the only reason my mind was able to utter it at all. Did you make a reservation?" It was a ridiculous thing to say. The woman hesitated. She slowly pulled her hand back into her lap. "No reservation. We are sadly booked out for today." My voice was hoarse and strained and barely audible. "I'm afraid you'll need to come back some other time." She sat there in silence. The steady ticking of the kitchen clock above the kitchen sink was the only sound in the room. "I would like to make a reservation," she finally said. "For tomorrow. We're all booked out tomorrow, too. Next week. We're booked out all week. We're booked out all year." I nearly shouted those last two words. "All year?" The glowing orbs that were her eyes suddenly flared up. They visibly whitened within the darkness. She suddenly leaned forward. Her hands slammed onto the table. Her nails dug deep into the wooded surface, leaving deep scratch marks. All year, all year, all year. This was it. I had pushed the lie too far. Any moment now she would fling herself from the chair and onto me. All year. All year. All year. Her voice grew louder and louder, and her body threw itself downward, shivering and pulsing, fists slamming onto the table, and then all of a sudden all tension fell away from her. She pushed herself back into a sitting position, now perfectly still once more. "Next year then," she said. "This day." I'm making a reservation for this very day 1 year from now. Before I could think of a way to respond, she reached for the candle. Her hand pushed into the glass jar, showing no sign of being affected by the heat. Her fingertips closed around the flame. There was a sharp hiss when the fire touched her skin, and then there was darkness, and then she was gone. The only evidence that she had ever been there were the deep uneven scratches on the table, and the cloying sweet smell of her perfume still hanging in the air. A whispering echo reached my ears, sounding from everywhere and nowhere at once. Such a warm and pretty thing. 1 day has already passed since then, but since next year is a leap year, there are still 365 days remaining. 365 days to figure out how to cancel a dinner date with a monster. Number 2. I played a secret PlayStation game from Japan when I was a kid and it still haunts me today. Part 1. I made it out that night, but the thirst for and the haunting of my brain by the game didn't go away. It never went away. I felt more and more like I was trapped in that awful endless game throughout my life. Life did not go well. Especially after I figured out the only way to soothe the endless mind terror of the game was to drown it in as much alcohol and drugs as I could, until I blacked out and passed out. This behavior wiped out all my teenage years. The only thing that stopped it was getting myself thrown in prison in my 20s and getting years to dry out. Then I got spit put in my 30s. Nowhere to go. Totally unprepared for life. I went back to my hometown. That was about the only option I had. I walked around the town endlessly and aimlessly. Being on the move tended to push away the monsters in my head, and, yes, they were still stalking me all these years later. I had never broken the chain of mental terror of the game. I was shocked to see the video game stores still open at the edge of town. There was no choice but to go in. I was further shocked to find the layout almost exactly the same, sans Morton. Instead, a tall man about my age was behind the counter, long greasy hair, playing a game on a PC. He didn't acknowledge me in the slightest. I walked the racks of games, always one eye on the man behind the counter. I knew him. It was definitely Nat, just aged like me, some white hair and a sad attempt at a beard, some wrinkles on his forehead. Nat was giving off the energy and posture of someone who was doing everything he could to avoid being talked to. I wasn't going to let it slide this time. I called him by his name. He seemed shocked. He still barely acknowledged me. The only information he would give me was that Morton died years earlier and handed the shop down to him. It felt like he was going to slip away from helping me again, until I mentioned a name which caught his ear. Callan. Nat finally stopped playing the game and made eye contact. What did I know about Callan? Not much. She was just my out-of-my-league childhood crush from growing up, and I knew he was with her. Nat went back to ignoring me, until I brought up the game, from Japan. This caught his attention again. After correcting that the game wasn't from Japan, he asked me a question. What was your experience with the game? I ruined my life, I answered. Nat finally let down his wall of frigid cold cool. He looked at me with moisture in his eyes. Mine too, Nat muttered. It felt terrible to see Nat so broken. He was like this magical cool, ahead of his time, gamer badass when we were growing up, and now he looked like an underfed and beaten dog. I could sense a particular sadness ever since I mentioned Callan. Where's Callan? I asked. At home, Nat dropped a big revelation like it was nothing. Morton said you could beat the game though. Didn't that solve the problem? I asked. Nat didn't answer, but I felt no hope radiate out of him. So how are you getting through all this then? I asked. It's just a struggle every day, Nat explained. Do you want it to be that way forever? I asked. Nat looked up at me, finally with some life in his eyes. Nat had buried his copy of the game underneath an abandoned cabin out in the woods behind his parents' house. He took me out there and told the true story of the game as we ventured to it. Yes, Nat had beaten the game. One time, and it almost killed him. He explained the game seemed to connect more and more with you the longer you played it, and you could feel it poisoning your blood and mind as you played. Beating it almost killed him. He didn't beat it for himself though. He beat it for Callan. She had found the game at his house and played it, driving herself mad, to the point it almost killed her. He had her hold the controller with him and helped her, while not looking at the screen as much as he could, so she would be the one processing beating the game. But he beat the game and saved her the best he could. She was tired and damaged afterwards, but she said the game didn't permeate her mind and life the way it did Nat's after that. It helped them stay together. They went from first loves to life partners and had stayed strong together over the years. Nat kept trying to beat the game on his own, and he never could, and each time he tried, he lost a little more of himself, and let a little more of the game into his psyche. He eventually gave up. He found that he could manage it with copious amounts of marijuana, and keeping his life simple. He also found happiness in Callan being able to live her life, though she had always seemed tired from experiencing the game all those years before, like it was a parasite that would never truly let her go. We found the game. The sight of that blank disc took my breath away. We thought that we would have a better chance if we tried it together. We fired up the game and our nerves filled the room in his little apartment. Going back into the game for the first time in decades was harrowing. I couldn't do anything else. Couldn't move outside of controlling the game. I started to sweat. The game was even harder than I remembered. It was so dark you could barely see. The monsters seemed to be hiding around every corner, and they'd launch at you the second they saw you and take you out. Nat and I took turns, and neither of us could survive for more than a few minutes. We just kept dying, and it seemed to take the energy, life, and wind out of us each time. The two of us sat down after a few deaths. The two of us both knew we were starting to swiftly wither away. We were older and more weathered. The game was taking more of a toll on our bodies and minds. I was starting to get lightheaded after losing my life in the game for what must have been 50 times. It was getting late into the night and I could hardly stay awake, yet I kept playing on. I have no idea when I fell asleep or passed out. All I knew was that I woke up at some point in the middle of the night and could see Nat still playing, the remote in his hand, but him on the ground, on one knee, his face glued to the TV. Nat looked terrible. His face was bright red, his body was leaned forward like he had a terrible pain in his stomach, and he was gasping for air. He looked like he was being strangled. I looked closer at the screen and saw one of the faceless monsters on the screen. I could see his arms reaching out in the POV. The monster was choking out Nat. I rushed to Nat and reached for the controller. I felt something push me backward, full on knocking me over. I felt a cold, strong grasp around my neck as I laid on the ground. I tried to fight back and push the energy off me, but couldn't. It was far too strong. The oxygen started to no longer get to my brain. My vision started to get foggy. I felt like my entire body got heavy, like I could no longer move it. Then, darkness. I woke up on the floor breathless, pained, and confused. I saw a familiar face towering above me, but horribly aged. I didn't recognize him at first, and then it came into focus. It was Morton. He was old and looked like shit, but there was no denying it was him. There was no way I could mistake that disapproving scowl. The urge to say something to Morton came over me. He held a finger to his lips. Silence. I obeyed. Morton's eyes went back to the screen, and I looked him over again. He had the PlayStation remote in his hand. He had concentration on his face. His legs wobbled, weak, as if he was struggling to keep his balance. He certainly looked like he was in a fight. And he was struggling and fighting. I looked at the screen and Morton was taking on an entire room full of the monsters. I had never made it as far in the game as Morton appeared to have made it. He was outside. I had never been there. He also appeared to be doing a good job at it. I felt myself feel like I was wrapped in a bear hug. I looked up at the screen and saw the monsters overtaking Morton. I started to feel my body crunch. It felt like I was getting rolled up into a 1,000-pound rug. I could feel my body telling me I didn't have much time left. I looked next to me and saw Nat on the floor as well, not looking good at all. The black was returning to my senses. I couldn't hold out under this squeezing for much longer. I started to scream. Nat screamed. Morton grumbled and flexed, playing the game as hard as he could. I felt something else coming over me, over the pain and the torture and the wasted life. I felt someone fighting for me. I felt Morton fighting for me. The TV screen started to shake. I saw on the screen it looked like Morton was going to work on one final monster, a large one, and it was backpedaling. I felt the squeezing feeling on me start to let go. I could breathe again. I felt like I could get up. I watched the monster explode on the screen above me. I then watched the glass of the TV explode, showering the three of us with sparks and dark glass. There was a moment of silence with an absence of movement. Then the world started to come back to me. I was alive, and it felt significantly better. Then Morton collapsed onto the floor between Nat and I. Morton had terminal cancer. He hadn't actually died yet. He confided in Nat when he got sick and disappeared and told Nat to tell everyone that he simply died. But the truth was he just gave up the store, moved away, and tried to do treatment in peace. Nat reached out to him when we were failing at the game. Morton was the next best video gamer that he knew and wanted to see if he could help. Nat and I had failed and passed out by the time Morton arrived. Morton knew it would kill him much sooner if he tried and beat the game, but he gave it a go anyway. And he saved both our lives. We owed him everything. Nat and I went to Morton's hospital room. He wouldn't talk to us, or let us look at him. He would only communicate by a whiteboard which he would write answers to our verbal questions on, and hand it around a curtain next to his bed. Morton explained he could go at any minute, and that he needed some help from us. He also very much in his fashion revealed something I never thought about. Morton showed us the whiteboard it read. "This wasn't the first time I did this for you, either." It clicked with me as soon as I saw his writing on the whiteboard. I could see that dark figure standing over me that night at Corey's house when someone saved me from the monsters in the game. Martin must have been keeping an eye on me or Corey's house and came to save me, but kept himself hidden. Martin quickly changed the conversation on his whiteboard and handed us a list in Excel sheet printed out, with a note explaining these were the copies of the dreaded game which were still out there. He finished by saying he had enough energy for one last question. Would we go out and try to track down the copies of the game and destroy them? Number 3. Earlier this year, I was dealing with the fresh aftermath of my breakup, and sleep was a stranger. I couldn't find rest since my mind was racing with the questions and confusing answers I got from my ex. In the day, I would find the courage to start writing my manuscript for work, which exhausted me mentally. My eyes wouldn't feel tired, but I desperately needed sleep. I was dreaming about whispering something to my ex-boyfriend's ear. But I was a speck, just a silhouette behind him. My senses came alive when my view shifted to my bed. It showed me how I would see my bed if I was lying on my right side, clutching my stuffed toy penguin close to my chest. Suddenly, there was movement. It felt off, and right there, I knew I was still dreaming. My dream mind takes the processing slow, but my surroundings didn't agree. There was someone on the bed beside me. My instincts told me that it was the one with the rapid movement. I looked up and witnessed it. It was a lady sitting skeptically straight and staring down at me. Half of her face was in darkness, and now that I'm writing this, I still couldn't be sure if it was a void or just the room placing shadows. Feeling stupidly brave and confused, I held up her stare. She didn't move, still shooting daggers at me. People have told me I am able to gauge their current emotions, so I wasn't unsure when I knew how angry the lady was. I could feel her intense emotions as if it wasn't just a dream. In times like this when my dream gets creepy, I could almost always push myself to wake up. And when I did, I was so terrified of closing my eyes again. The lady might still be there, waiting for me to come back and see her again. I stayed awake for hours until I could no longer hold it. I don't remember anything about what happened after I closed my eyes. But the dream lady didn't stay quiet for long. My roommate met her just last weekend. We are 4 in one unit and we are close with one another, so it's not unusual if we tell each other our dreams sometimes. My other roommate went to sleep very late that night, only to wake up in the middle of the devil's hour. She woke up in the same position that I did. On her side, she saw that she was cuddling someone. At first she thought it was her older sister, so she started stroking its hair. But realization dawned on her. She wasn't at home and her sister doesn't live in our apartment unit. It was something else. Stopped in her tracks, my roommate froze in fear. Who is this entity? She then stopped stroking its hair, terrified of its concealed identity. The lady, or entity as we pertained to her, was now growling and struggling. Such an eerie sight, but my roommate managed to wake up in time before the growling gets out of hand. After recounting her dream, I asked her if the entity was a lady with unruly wavy hair that spans up to her torso. She was livid and shocked as I gave the entire description of the entity she met. Its hair was unkempt, as if she forgot to brush it after taking a bath that it dried on its own unruly way. I wasn't able to touch it, but deep in my mind I know how it is terrifying to hold something eerie while dreaming. The sensation would linger, and you would subconsciously think about it when you see your reflection and brush your hair. Contrary to hers, I didn't hear any growling in my dream. But I saw her face. It was half a dark shadow and a manifestation of something menacing but almost strange to even exist. It had a blinding white circle for eye that had hurt to look at. As uncomfortable as it was, it still was hard to take your eyes off her face. I even thought it was my future self getting mad at me for even thinking about seeing my ex in dreams. Now the thought of it sends chills down to my marrow. When one of the roommates saw her too, I know it has nothing to do with the ex. It is something else. We're not sure if this entity lives in our apartment or was just a creation of our exhausted minds trying to get some sleep. To have some sort of safety in any sense, we all agreed to convene once anyone meets the entity, first time or not. Thanks for tuning in to Demonic Diaries, where we explore the darkest corners of the human psyche. Stay tuned for more spine-tingling tales, and don't forget to keep the lights on. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and embrace the darkness. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe to Demonic Diaries for more terrifying tales. Your support helps us bring you more hair-raising content, so be sure to hit that notification bell to never miss an upload. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.